They mocked her weight and gave her away until the Duke called her his bride. The market square falls silent as laughter echoes. Her uncle slams down the cards, and the crowd jeers at the young woman he's traded like chattel. Dust swirls, a church bell tolls, and shame burns hotter than the noonday sun. But just as the ink is about to seal her fate, a cloaked rider bursts through the doors. He halts the mockery with a voice that shakes the room. This isn't a jest, this is a duke's claim, yet the cruel whispers do not die. Rumors spread, lies twist tighter, and the world conspires to tear them apart. What secret power does love hold when the whole world calls it a scandal? And can the woman mocked as worthless rise to become a duchess who silences them all? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. Autumn's sun warmed the cobblestones of Yorkshire's market square as Eleanor Hargrave arranged fresh loaves on her wooden stall. The crusty bread, still warm from the morning's baking, filled the air with an inviting aroma. She adjusted her woolen shawl, trying to ignore the sideways glances and whispered comments from the well-dressed women passing by. "Look at the size of her," one woman muttered behind her fan. "She must sample more than she sells." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her hands steady as she wrapped a loaf in brown paper for an elderly customer. "God bless you, dearie," the old woman said, pressing a copper penny into Eleanor's palm. "Bless you as well, Mrs. Cooper," Eleanor replied softly, grateful for the kindness in the woman's rheumy eyes. Her uncle slouched against the corner of their stall, his eyes already glazed from his morning visit to the alehouse. The coins in their money box had grown pitifully few, and Eleanor could see his mounting frustration in the way he yanked at his collar and cursed under his breath. "Not enough," he growled, counting the day's earnings for the third time. "Never enough with you manning the stall. Your size frightens away the customers." Eleanor blinked back tears, focusing on straightening the remaining loaves. The bread was good. She'd learned her mother's recipe well before the fever had taken both her parents. But her uncle's gambling debts grew deeper with each passing month, and no amount of honest work seemed to satisfy him. A burst of raucous laughter drew her attention to the alehouse stall nearby, where Master Sedgwick held court among his crude companions. The merchant's rich clothes couldn't disguise his coarse nature as he slapped down cards and coins with equal enthusiasm. "Uncle, please," Eleanor whispered as her uncle's bloodshot eyes fixed on the card game. "We should focus on our sales." But he was already stumbling toward Master Sedgwick's table, drawn by the glint of silver coins like a moth to flame. Eleanor's heart sank as she watched him join the game, knowing their day's earnings would soon vanish into the merchant's purse. The afternoon wore on, and the market grew louder as more men gathered to watch the gaming. Eleanor tried to tend her stall, but her uncle's voice rose above the crowd, slurred with ale and desperation. "I'll wager something better than coin," he declared, swaying on his feet. "My niece's hand in marriage to the winner of the next hand." The crowd erupted in jeers and laughter. Eleanor froze, her bread basket falling from numb fingers. "Uncle, you cannot. Silence, girl," he snapped, turning back to the table where Master Sedgwick studied her with calculating eyes. "A plump prize indeed," the merchant sneered, dealing the cards with practiced flourish. "Though she might eat me out of house and home." Fresh waves of laughter washed over Eleanor as she stood rooted to the spot, humiliation burning through her very bones. The baker's daughter wagered like a sack of flour. She wanted to run, to hide, but years of her uncle's scorn had taught her to endure with quiet dignity. "Done." Master Sedgwick crowed moments later, displaying his winning hand. "The girl is mine, then." He rose, spreading his arms to accept the crowd's congratulations. "Please," Eleanor begged her uncle, who merely turned away, already eyeing the alehouse door. "You cannot sell me like..." "Hold." A deep voice cut through the marketplace chaos. The crowd parted as a tall figure in a fine wool cloak strode forward, his features shadowed by his hood. "Have you no shame?" the stranger demanded, his refined accent marking him as a gentleman. "To mock an honest woman's labor and treat her virtue as a gambling chip." Master Sedgwick's face darkened. "Mind your business, sir. The game was fair." "Fair?" The stranger's voice carried across the now silent square. "I see nothing fair in this display. This lady shows more nobility in her quiet dignity than the lot of you with your cruel jests." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd held back all day. Someone had finally spoken in her defense, seeing past her sighs to her heart. The stranger turned to her, though his hood still concealed his features. "Pay them no mind, miss. No soul of true worth would laugh at honest work or gentle spirit." Before Eleanor could find her voice to thank him, he had turned and strode away, his cloak billowing in the autumn breeze. The crowd dispersed slowly, chastened by his words, leaving Eleanor trembling but somehow strengthened by this unexpected act of kindness. The cottage's wooden walls creaked in the evening wind as Eleanor stirred the meager soup hanging over the hearth. Shadows danced across the rough-hewn floor, cast by the dying fire that offered little warmth against the autumn chill. From the adjacent room, she heard her uncle's slurred voice rising and falling as he spoke with someone at their door. "Aye, she'd do well enough for you," her uncle declared, his words thick with ale. "The contract's as good as signed. She'll clear my debts, she will." Eleanor's wooden spoon clattered against the pot. Her hands trembled as she recognized Master Sedgwick's oily tone responding. "Indeed, she served well enough in my household. Though she's no prize, she'll work off your debt." Gathering her courage, Eleanor crept to the doorway. "Uncle, please," she whispered, her voice quavering. "You cannot mean to." He whirled on her, his face mottled with anger. "Cannot? Cannot? I can, and I will. What else are you good for?" He gestured wildly at her figure. "Look at you. No proper gentleman would have you. At least this way you'll be of some use to me." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks as she backed away from his fury. "I've worked hard, kept your house, baked your bread, and eaten half of it. By the looks of you," he snarled, causing Sedgwick to laugh cruelly. "The contract will be registered tomorrow. That's the end of it." Sleep evaded Eleanor that night. She lay in her narrow bed, praying for deliverance until dawn's weak light filtered through her window. The morning bells had barely finished tolling when a sharp rap at the door announced the parish beadle. "Miss Hargrave," he announced formally, "your presence is required at the registry office." His expression held a hint of pity as he added, "To witness the recording of your contract." Eleanor wrapped her worn cloak tightly around her shoulders and followed him through the village. Her shoes squelched in the muddy lane as passing neighbors turned to stare. Some whispered behind their hands, while others quickly looked away. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her shoulders more heavily than any burden she'd ever carried. The registry office stood cold and formal, its windows reflecting the gray morning light. Inside, Master Sedgwick waited with an air of smug satisfaction, contract papers clutched in his thick fingers. The clerk sat ready at his desk, quill poised over the heavy ledger. "Come, come," Sedgwick beckoned impatiently. "Let's have this done. I've business to attend to." Eleanor's feet felt leaden as she approached the desk. The clerk dipped his quill in ink, preparing to record her fate in permanent strokes. The contract between Master James Sedgwick and Miss Eleanor Hargrave, transferred from the authority of Mr. Thomas Hargrave. The heavy door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. A tall figure in a dark cloak strode in, his boots ringing against the wooden floor. "That contract is void," he declared in a commanding voice that filled the room. Eleanor's heart leaped as she recognized the stranger from the marketplace. But as he threw back his hood, gasps echoed through the room. His noble bearing was unmistakable, the straight spine, the proud set of his jaw, the quality of his clothing now visible beneath the cloak. "Your Grace." The clerk stumbled to his feet, bobbing in a bow. "Duke of Wexler." "Indeed." Edward Hafford, Duke of Wexler, fixed Sedgwick with a stern gaze. "That contract holds no power, as Miss Hargrave is already under my protection and authority." Sedgwick's face purpled. "But her uncle has no right to sell what was never his to sell," the Duke cut in sharply. "Miss Hargrave is a free-born Englishwoman, not chattel to be traded." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "You need fear this no longer, Miss Hargrave. You have my word." The room had fallen so silent that Eleanor could hear the scratch of the clerk's quill as he hastily crossed out the unfinished entry. She stared at the Duke in wonder, scarcely daring to believe this dramatic turn of events. Her heart pounded in her chest as she curtsied deeply, overwhelmed by this unexpected salvation. The registry office fell into stunned silence. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace," he stammered, adjusting his spectacles, "do I understand correctly that you wish to intervene in this matter?" "You understand perfectly," Edward replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of command. The morning sunlight streaming through the dusty windows caught the gold buttons of his fine coat. "No woman shall be bartered like cattle in Yorkshire or anywhere else in England while I draw breath." Eleanor's uncle, his face flushed with drink and rage, took a half-step forward before thinking better of it. Even in his current state, he knew better than to challenge a duke. Instead, he gripped the edge of the clerk's desk, knuckles white. "My lord," he ground out, "the girl is my responsibility, and you have abdicated any right to that responsibility through your deplorable conduct." Edward cut in, his tone sharp as steel. The Duke turned to Eleanor, his expression softening as he met her bewildered gaze. "Miss Hargrave, I pray you will forgive my dramatic entrance." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of this impossible turn of events. Her hands twisted in her worn skirts as she waited for the cruel jest to reveal itself, for the laughter to begin. But Edward's eyes held only kindness and something else, something that made her heart flutter strangely in her chest. "I first saw you yesterday in the market square," Edward continued, his voice gentle now. "Your Grace, in the face of such unkindness, spoke more of true nobility than any title could convey." He took a step closer, and Eleanor found she could not look away from his earnest face. "I had intended to make your acquaintance properly, through proper channels. But when I learned of this ... he gestured to the contract on the clerk's desk with evident disgust. "I could not stand idle." The clerk dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. "Your Grace, what exactly do you propose?" Edward squared his shoulders, every inch the Duke despite his road-worn traveling clothes. "I declare my intention to make Miss Hargrave my bride, with her consent." He turned back to Eleanor, whose legs had gone weak with shock. "The banns must be read in church, of course, but I am prepared to seek a special license if there is any opposition." A wave of muttering swept through the small crowd that had gathered in the registry office. Eleanor felt their stares like physical things, some scandalized, others envious, a few merely curious. She took a shaky breath. "My lord," she whispered, "surely you cannot mean to—" "The scandal would be ... double quotes." "I care nothing for scandal," Edward replied firmly. "I care for honor, for kindness, for the qualities I saw in you yesterday as you bore both labor and cruelty with such dignity. Will you allow me to prove my sincerity?" Before Eleanor could respond, her uncle lurched forward. "This is madness. She's not fit to be a duke's wife. Look at her." "I am looking," Edward said coldly, "at my future duchess should she accept me." His gaze never left Eleanor's face. "What say you, Miss Hargrave?" Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes, but for the first time in years, they were not tears of shame or sorrow. She managed a tremulous nod as evening descended. Eleanor found herself seated in the Duke of Wexley's personal carriage, still struggling to believe the day's events were real. The leather seats were softer than any chair she had ever known, the lanterns casting a warm glow over the elegant interior. Her small satchel, containing everything she owned in the world, sat beside her. Edward had arranged everything with swift efficiency, brooking no argument from her uncle or anyone else. Now, as the carriage rolled through the darkening countryside, he explained that they would travel for 2 days to reach Wexley Hall. Eleanor watched through the window as the first torches of his vast estate began to gleam in the distance, like earthbound stars beckoning her toward a future she had never dared to imagine. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar silk curtains. The bed was impossibly soft, nothing like her thin straw mattress at home. For a moment, she lay still, wondering if it had all been a dream. The registry office, the Duke's intervention, the long carriage ride to Wexley Hall. A gentle knock at the door made her sit up. 2 ladies' maids entered, carrying fresh linens and a morning dress of pale blue silk. They bobbed quick curtsies, their expressions uncertain. "Good morning, miss," the older one said. "We've come to help you dress." "Oh." Eleanor flushed, already climbing from the bed. "That's very kind, but I can manage. I've always dressed myself." The maids exchanged worried glances. "But miss," the younger one protested, "it wouldn't be proper. Lady Agatha was most specific about preparing you for your new station." Eleanor's heart sank. Of course, a future duchess couldn't simply throw on her clothes like a commoner. Still, after several awkward attempts to let them help, she managed to convince them to simply lay out her clothes and leave her in peace. Once dressed, Eleanor's feet carried her naturally toward the kitchens. The familiar sense of yeast and wood smoke drew her like a beacon through the vast manor. In the massive kitchen, several servants worked at various tasks, all pausing to stare when she entered. "Good morning," Eleanor said warmly. "Might I help with the bread?" The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Thackeray, gaped at her. "Help? But miss, you're to be our duchess." "I may be a duchess someday, but I'll always be a baker at heart." Eleanor rolled up her sleeves. "Please, I'd feel more at home with flour on my hands." Slowly, the kitchen staff's rigid postures relaxed. Mrs. Thackeray showed her to a flour-dusted workspace, and soon Eleanor lost herself in the familiar rhythm of kneading dough. The servants worked alongside her, first in silence, then with growing ease as Eleanor shared tips about proving dough and testing temperature. By mid-morning, word had spread through the countryside. Carriages began arriving, bearing local gentry eager to glimpse the Duke's unusual choice of bride. Eleanor could hear their whispers as she passed through the halls. "A baker's niece? How extraordinary! Did you see how round she is? Most peculiar taste, the Duke has. I heard she was sold at market like a common slave." Each comment struck like a physical blow, but Eleanor held her head high, remembering Edward's words about dignity. Still, she felt increasingly out of place among the fine furnishings and formal manners of Wexley Hall. Edward found her in the library that afternoon, hiding behind a shelf of books. His smile was as warm as ever. "Are you well, my dear?" "They think me a joke," Eleanor whispered. "Perhaps they're right. I know nothing of being a duchess. You know everything about being kind and true," Edward replied, taking her hand. "That matters far more than knowing which fork to use at dinner." That evening, Eleanor sat beside Edward in the great hall, trying not to fidget in her fine dress as visiting nobles dined around them. The Countess of Millbrook, a sharp-featured woman in expensive silk, sat across from them, watching Eleanor's every move with narrowed eyes. When Eleanor reached for her water glass, the Countess's lip curled. "My word," she drawled, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "Those hands! So rough and red. Like a common scullery maid's." The table fell silent. Eleanor's cheeks burned as she tried to hide her hands in her lap. But Edward reached over, gently lifting her right hand in his. "These hands," he declared clearly, "create beauty from simple flour and water. They heal with herbs, comfort with kindness, and work with honest skill. Then, meeting the Countess's gaze directly, he raised Eleanor's hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. I could not be prouder to hold them. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor's heart swelled as Edward squeezed her fingers gently, keeping her hand in his as the meal continued. In that moment, she felt truly worthy of his love. Regardless of her birth or station, Eleanor stood at the window of her chamber, watching the morning frost glitter across Wexley's vast gardens. A commotion in the courtyard below caught her attention. A tenant farmer was rushing toward the main entrance, his face lined with worry. Minutes later, a footman knocked at her door. "Begging your pardon, miss, but His Grace requests your presence downstairs. There's a matter requiring attention." Eleanor hurried down, her skirts rustling against the grand staircase. In the entrance hall, she found Edward speaking with Tom Fletcher, one of the estate's farmers. The man's weather-worn face was creased with fear. "My little Mary." "Your Grace," Tom was saying, his cap twisted in his rough hands. "The fever's taken her something terrible. Been burning up since dawn, she has." Edward turned as Eleanor approached. "Fletcher's daughter is ill. I recalled you mentioned your mother's skill with healing herbs." Eleanor's heart quickened. Her mother had indeed taught her the old remedies before consumption claimed her 3 winters past. "Yes, I know something of fever herbs. Perhaps I might help." "The noble ladies arriving for tea will have to wait," Edward said firmly. "This is more pressing." Eleanor rushed to the kitchen, gathering dried herbs from her own small store feverfew, yarrow, and mint. The cook helped her prepare a healing broth, adding chicken stock to strengthen the child. Within minutes, they were in Edward's carriage, bouncing along the rutted lane to Fletcher's cottage. They arrived to find several fine carriages already parked nearby. The expected noble visitors had followed, curious about the Duke's unusual behavior. Ladies in silk gowns stood watching from a careful distance as Eleanor hurried inside, her apron pocket full of herbs. The cottage was small but clean, with a single room warmed by the hearth. Mary lay on a narrow bed, her small face flushed with fever. Her mother sat beside her, dabbing the child's forehead with a damp cloth. "Please, let me help," Eleanor said softly, already moving to the fire to steep her herbs. The visiting nobles crowded the doorway, whispering behind their fans. Eleanor heard fragments of their gossip. A future duchess playing nursemaid? Most irregular ... What can a baker's girl know of healing? But Eleanor focused only on her task, measuring herbs with steady hands. She hummed old hymns as she worked, the same ones her mother had sung while tending the sick. The familiar melodies seemed to soothe little Mary, whose breathing grew less labored. Hour after hour, Eleanor sat beside the child, spooning broth and herbal tea between her cracked lips. She bathed Mary's hot face with cool cloths and told gentle stories to distract her from the discomfort. Edward remained nearby, his presence lending authority to her simple healing work. As afternoon faded to evening, Mary's fever finally broke. The child's eyes opened, clear and bright, and she managed a weak smile. "The angel lady made me better," she whispered to her weeping mother. Mrs. Fletcher clasped Eleanor's work-roughened hands. "God bless you, miss. We'll not forget this kindness." Word spread quickly through the village. By sunset, several cottagers had gathered outside, bringing small gifts of eggs and vegetables to show their gratitude. They curtsied to Eleanor with genuine respect, not for her future title, but for her compassionate heart. Back at Wexley Hall, the evening's formal supper was already laid out. The visiting nobles sat stiffly around the long table, still processing the day's events. Eleanor slipped into her seat beside Edward, conscious of every eye upon her. Edward rose, lifting his glass. "Today we witness true nobility," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the grand dining room. "Not in silk or jewels or ancient titles, but in the gentle hands that heal, and the heart that sees no distinction between cottage and castle when there is." suffering to ease. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his words. Around the table, she saw thoughtful expressions replacing the usual sneers. Perhaps there was hope after all, not just for her acceptance among the nobility, but for building a bridge between two worlds that need not remain forever separate. For the first time since coming to Wexley Hall, Eleanor's smile held no trace of uncertainty as she met the gazes of those around her. She had found her place not by changing who she was, but by remaining true to the lessons of kindness her mother had taught her so long ago. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Wexley Hall's grand study as Edward's steward, Mr. Phillips, cleared his throat. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held up a letter bearing Master Sedgwick's seal. Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap as the steward began to read. "My Lord Duke," the letter began with false courtesy, "I write to inform you of certain matters regarding the woman, Eleanor Hargrave, who now resides at your estate." The steward's voice grew strained as he continued. "It grieves me to report that her reputation was already compromised before your noble intervention. Her uncle sought to sell her precisely because of these indiscretions, hoping to conceal the shame of her conduct." Eleanor's face drained of color. Edward, standing by the fireplace, his jaw tightening with each word, raised a hand to stop the reading. "Enough, this is pure malice, but the damage was already done." Within hours, the whispers began. Servants who had warmed to Eleanor now averted their eyes in the corridors. The housekeeper's normally friendly greetings became curt nods. Even the kitchen maids, who had shared recipes and laughter with her just days before, grew distant. By afternoon, several calling cards arrived from local gentry, each bearing thinly veiled inquiries about the disturbing news. Ladies who had begrudgingly accepted Eleanor's presence now had the excuse they sought to withdraw their support entirely. Lady Augusta Hefford, Edward's aunt, arrived unannounced that evening, her silver-streaked hair arranged severely beneath her widow's cap. She cornered Edward in the library while Eleanor listened from behind the partially closed door, her heart sinking with each sharp word. "The family name, Edward. Have you any idea what you've done?" Lady Augusta's voice cracked like a whip. "Every drawing room from here to London buzzes with talk of how the Duke of Wexley was deceived by a common schemer. Your mother would be mortified." "Aunt Augusta, I will not entertain these baseless accusations," Edward replied, his tone steady but strained. "Eleanor is a baker's niece," Lady Augusta cut in. "And now it seems one with a hidden past. Your position demands better. Think of your duties, your responsibilities to the title." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Through the crack in the door, she could see Edward pacing, his shoulders tense with barely contained anger. But it was his aunt's next words that pierced Eleanor's heart most deeply. "Already, 3 families have withdrawn their support for the hospital wing you plan to build. The Assembly Committee questions your judgment. Even the parish vicar hesitates to speak in your defense." Eleanor fled silently to her chamber, her vision blurred with tears. For hours, she sat at her small writing desk, watching the candle burn lower as she contemplated what must be done. The night grew deep and still, the great house quiet save for the occasional creak of ancient timbers. Near midnight, she began to write, her quill scratching softly against the parchment. "My dearest Edward, your kindness has been more than I deserve, but I cannot allow your reputation and good works to suffer for my sake. You must be free to fulfill your duties without the burden of scandal. I have brought upon your name... Her tears spotted the page as she continued, pouring out her gratitude and her sorrow. She wrote of her unworthiness, her deep affection, and her determination to remove herself from his path. As the clock struck 1, Eleanor moved silently through the darkened halls, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. She placed it carefully on Edward's desk, alongside the ring he had given her, a simple band that had meant more to her than any diamond dot in the stable yard. A carriage waited. She had told the groom it was for an early morning visit to the village church. Instead, wrapped in her warmest cloak, she directed the driver toward the remote cottage where she had spent her earliest years with her mother. As Wexley Hall's lights faded into the darkness behind her, Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her lips, muffling her quiet sobs while the carriage rolled into the night. The carriage wheels creaked and jolted over the rutted country lanes as Eleanor huddled deeper into her threadbare shawl. The pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gray. Each bump in the road matched the aching rhythm of her heart, reminding her of what and whom she was leaving behind. "'Tis better this way," she whispered to herself, watching her breath mist in the cold morning air. The hired carriage driver had given her odd looks when she'd requested this journey before sunrise, but a few coins from her meager savings had secured his silence. The familiar Yorkshire countryside rolled past, hills and hedgerows blending together in the early light. Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to Wexley Hall, to Edward's kind eyes and gentle hands. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them away. His reputation, his family name, they meant too much to be tarnished by association with her. By afternoon, the carriage finally turned down the narrow lane leading to her mother's old cottage. Eleanor's throat tightened at the sight of the small stone building, its windows dark and garden overgrown. She had not been here since her mother's passing 3 years ago. "God grant me strength," she murmured, gathering her single bag as the carriage drove away. The iron key was cold in her trembling fingers as she worked the lock. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, releasing the musty smell of long-abandoned rooms. Eleanor moved through the cottage like a ghost, running her hand along dust-covered furniture. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, her mother's spinning wheel in the corner, dried herbs still hanging from the rafters, the old Bible on its shelf. She knelt at the hearth, her skirts pooling around her, and set about laying a fire with shaking hands. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Eleanor sank to her knees beside it, clasping her hands in prayer. "Dear Lord," she whispered, tears finally falling freely, "grant Edward the wisdom to see that this is best. Let him find a bride worthy of his station, one who will bring honor to his name instead of shame." The afternoon light faded as Eleanor wept and prayed, her heart breaking anew with each passing hour. She thought of Edward discovering her note, imagining his face as he read her words of farewell. Would he be angry, relieved? Perhaps he would understand that she had acted to protect him from further scandal. Meanwhile, at Wexley Hall, Edward's voice thundered through the corridors as he discovered her absence. His hands trembled as he read her farewell note, written in careful script. "My dearest Edward, I cannot bear to be the cause of your ruin. You deserve a duchess who will bring honor to your name, not whispers and scandal. Please forget me. With eternal gratitude, Eleanor. Saddle my horse," he roared, crushing the note in his fist, "and send 4 guards to ride with me." His heart pounded with a mixture of fury and fear as servants scrambled to obey. How dare she decide his future without him? How dare she think herself unworthy? Rain began to fall as Edward and his guards thundered across the countryside. He knew where she must have gone. She had spoken of her mother's cottage once, in a quiet moment by the library fire. His cloak grew heavy with rain, but he pressed on, barely feeling the cold through his desperate worry. As the sun sank toward the horizon, Eleanor lit a single candle in the cottage. She knelt once more in prayer, her voice barely a whisper in the growing darkness. "Give me the strength to let him go," she pleaded, even as her heart cried out for him. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats made her freeze. Heavy boots pounded on the path outside, and before she could move, the cottage door burst open. Edward stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the last light of day. Rain dripped from his cloak, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, as their eyes met across the humble cottage room, the world seemed to pause. The candle flame flickered between them, casting shadows that danced across their faces as they gazed at each other in the growing darkness. The cottage door burst open with such force that the flame of Eleanor's candle wavered. There stood Edward, his dark cloak dripping with rain, his eyes fierce with emotion. Behind him, thunder rolled across the moors like drums in the night. "My lord," Eleanor gasped, scrambling to her feet. Her hands trembled as she set down the candle. "Please, you must not." But Edward crossed the small room in 3 long strides. He seized her trembling hands in his touch warm despite the chill of the storm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse with feeling, "do you truly believe I would let you go so easily? The rumors ... Your reputation ... double quote," she began, but Edward shook his head firmly. "Listen well, my dearest," he said, leading her to sit beside him on the rough wooden bench near the hearth. "While you were packing your belongings in secret, my steward was completing an investigation I had ordered weeks ago. We have uncovered the truth about Master Sedgwick." Eleanor's eyes widened. "What truth?" "The debts your uncle claimed to owe? Forged. Every last document." Edward's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "Sedgwick created false papers, thinking to pressure your uncle into that despicable arrangement. When I thwarted his scheme, he turned to slander out of spite. But the letter," Eleanor began, "was his final attempt to destroy what he could not possess." Edward's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "The man is a fraud, Eleanor. His reputation now lies in tatters, not ours." Fresh tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "Even so, my lord, I am still but a baker's niece. The whispers will never cease. Your family will learn to see what I see," Edward declared, his voice ringing with conviction. He knelt before her, still holding her hands. "I swear before God and you, Eleanor Hargrave, that no amount of slander or scandal can alter my love. You have shown more nobility in your kindness to that fevered child than most peers show in a lifetime. But, no," Edward's voice was tender but firm. "I have watched you tend the sick, comfort the grieving, and maintain your dignity through cruel mockery. That is the woman I choose to make my duchess. If society cannot see your worth, then society must learn to look with clearer eyes." Eleanor gazed into his steady gray eyes, seeing nothing but truth there. The warmth of his hands around her seemed to reach into her very soul, melting the ice of doubt that had driven her to flee. "Do you trust me?" Edward asked softly. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, and found she meant it with all her heart. "Then trust in this. I love you. Not despite your common birth, but because of who you are. Your compassion, your strength, your gentle heart. These are worth more than any title." A sob caught in Eleanor's throat as years of shame and uncertainty began to crumble. Edward drew her into his arms, holding her close as she wept against his shoulder. When her tears had subsided, Edward helped her to her feet. "Come home," he said simply. "Come home to Wexley Hall, where you belong." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Edward wrapped his own cloak around her shoulders, its fine wool still damp from his ride through the rain. Together, they stepped out into the night, where Edward's carriage waited. As they settled inside the well-appointed vehicle, Eleanor found herself drawn to Edward's side. He took her hand in his, their fingers interlacing naturally, as though they had always been meant to fit together this way. The carriage began its journey back to Wexley Hall. Through the window, Eleanor could see the first hints of dawn breaking over the misty moors. The pale light painted the rolling hills in shades of pearl and gold, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. "Look," Edward murmured, squeezing her hand. "A new day dawns." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, their clasped hands resting between them like a promise. The steady rhythm of the carriage wheels seemed to echo the beating of their hearts, carrying them forward together into the breaking light of morning. The great hall of Wexley buzzed with whispers as the assembled gentry gathered at Edward's summons. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching the gilt frames of ancestral portraits that lined the oak-paneled walls. Eleanor stood beside Edward at the front of the hall, her hands clasped tightly before her. Though her heart thundered beneath her modest blue gown, she held her head high. Edward's voice rang clear and commanding through the chamber. "My lords and ladies, I have called you here to right a grave injustice." He gestured to his steward, who stepped forward with a leather folio. "Master Sedgwick's claims against Miss Hargrave are not merely false, they are criminal." The steward spread documents across a polished table. "These are the merchant's true ledgers, discovered in his counting house. They show systematic fraud, not only against Miss Hargrave's uncle, but dozens of others." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the evidence mounted. Forged signatures, altered dates, inflated debts, all laid bare in damning detail. Sedgwick, standing near the back, grew pale as parchment. "Furthermore," Edward continued, his tone sharp with controlled anger, "the supposed contract binding Miss Hargrave was falsified, bearing a signature that does not match her uncle's hand." He fixed Sedgwick with a stern gaze. "You sought to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to hide your own misdeeds." The merchant tried to bluster. "Your Grace, surely." "Silence." Edward's command cracked like a whip. "You are hereby banned from all commerce within this county. Let it be known that any who deal with Master Sedgwick do so at their own peril." Guards stepped forward to escort the disgraced merchant out. As he passed Eleanor, she met his gaze without flinching. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and something tight in Eleanor's chest began to loosen. The following Sunday, golden morning light filled the parish church as the banns were read for the first time. Eleanor sat in the Duke's family pew, feeling the weight of every stare. Yet when Edward's hand found hers, warm and steady, she drew strength from his touch. "I publish the banns of marriage between Edward James Hafford, Duke of Wexley, of this parish, and Eleanor Marie Hargrave, also of this parish," the vicar announced. "This is the first time of asking." Murmurs rustled like autumn leaves through the congregation, but Edward's presence beside her remained unwavering. After the service, several noble ladies who had once scorned Eleanor approached with cautious congratulations. She accepted their words with gentle dignity, neither gloating nor groveling. The second Sunday brought fewer whispers, more genuine smiles. Eleanor had spent the week visiting tenant families, sharing her knowledge of herbs and healing. Word spread of her kindness, her skill with medicines, her humble grace. Even the most skeptical nobles found it harder to dismiss her. By the third Sunday, the mood had shifted entirely. The church bells pealed joyously across the valley as Edward and Eleanor emerged into the sunshine. Village children scattered rose petals in their path, while women pressed forward with baskets of fresh-baked bread and summer blooms. "God bless you, miss," called the farmer whose child Eleanor had nursed back to health. His daughter darted forward to present a posy of wildflowers. "Thank you, dear heart," Eleanor said softly, bending to accept the gift. When she straightened, tears of joy brightened her eyes. Edward drew her hand through his arm, smiling down at her with pure devotion. Together they walked through the cheerful crowd, accepting congratulations and blessings. The same villagers who had once witnessed Eleanor's humiliation now celebrated her triumph. Near the church gate, Eleanor paused to break apart a loaf of bread, sharing pieces with the gathered children. The gesture seemed to touch even the proudest nobles present, a future duchess who remembered her roots, who would bring compassion to her high station. The summer breeze carried the scent of roses and fresh bread, mingling with the echo of bells still ringing across the valley. Love had indeed proved stronger than malice, truth mightier than slander. As Eleanor walked beside Edward through the shower of petals and good wishes, she finally felt at peace. She had found her place not despite who she was, but because of it. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor of the parish church. Eleanor stood at the entrance, her heart fluttering beneath the simple white gown she had lovingly sewn with her own hands. Delicate lace trimmed the modest neckline, and tiny pearls, a gift from Edward, adorned the bodice. As the organ filled the church with sacred music, Eleanor took her first step down the aisle. Tears of joy sparkled in her eyes, making the candlelight dance. She clutched a bouquet of wildflowers and roses, gathered that morning from the manor gardens. At the altar, Edward stood tall and proud in his finest coat. His eyes never left Eleanor's face as she approached, his expression one of pure adoration. To him, she was the most beautiful sight he had ever beheld. When they joined hands before the vicar, Edward's warm grip steadied Eleanor's trembling fingers. Their voices rang clear and true through their vows, promising love and faithfulness before God and their assembled witnesses. After the sacred words were spoken and rings exchanged, Edward turned to address the gathered congregation. His voice carried to every corner of the hushed church. "Today, I am honored beyond measure to call this woman my wife," he declared. Some mocked her as too large for society's narrow vision. But I say her heart is more expansive than any title could encompass, her spirit more noble than mere birth could bestow. Sniffles echoed through the church as his words touched both noble and common hearts. The farmer's wife, whose child Eleanor had healed, dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Even the proudest ladies of the gentry were seen wiping away tears. Weeks later, Eleanor walked through her old market square, her arm linked contentedly through Edward's. The morning air was crisp with autumn's touch, carrying the scent of fresh bread and turning leaves. The same gossips who had once whispered cruel jests now dropped into deep curtsies as she passed. "Your Grace," they murmured respectfully, nudging their children forward. Eleanor's basket was filled with warm loaves, which she freely distributed to the eager little ones who gathered around her. Their small hands reached up trustingly, their faces bright with smiles. She answered with her own gentle warmth, watching his wife's generous spirit touch yet more hearts. Edward leaned close to whisper in her ear, "My bride, my duchess, my heart's true home." Eleanor's eyes glistened as she smiled up at him, knowing at last that love had transformed mockery into respect, cruelty into kindness, and a market square of pain into a place of joy. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.